Welcome to Lesson 6.6, Conducting Security Assessments, Penetration Testing. In your Candidate Information Bulletin, we are in the Security Assessment and Testing domain. We are in Key Area of Knowledge B, which is Conduct Security Control Testing, and D, Analyze and Report Test Output. Our topics for this lesson will include penetration testing objectives, penetration test scenarios, test phases, common operating system and software exploits, and communication of findings and reporting. So the objective of penetration testing is to evaluate the security of a target by identifying and then attempting to exploit vulnerabilities, improper configurations, and hidden points of entry. Now, sometimes penetration testing, when it's done for good, is referred to as ethical hacking. Penetration testing mimics real-world attack methodology. Penetration testing generally involves exploiting combinations of vulnerabilities on one or more systems. So in the last lesson, we talked about a surface vulnerability, which was just a single vulnerability in isolation. Generally, penetration tests will take advantage of multiple vulnerabilities together. Penetration testing can be useful for determining incident detection and response capability. So in addition to seeing if we can identify vulnerabilities, if we can exploit vulnerabilities, it's also interesting to know in a penetration test, are there any alerts that go off? Are there any indications that an attack is happening? And how long does it take internal personnel to respond to the attack? Our penetration test scenarios can be designed to simulate either an external attack, so coming from the outside, an internal attack taking place inside on the corporate network, or both. Now, external scenarios simulate the outsider attack, where internal scenarios simulate the actions of a malicious insider. Could be an employee, could be a visitor. Penetration testing may also include non-technical methods of attack, such as physical access and social engineering. In planning a penetration test, we have some decisions about organizational knowledge to make. We can have overt penetration testing or covert penetration testing. If we're doing overt penetration testing, management, information technology personnel, security personnel, perhaps third-party personnel, all have full knowledge that the testing is going to occur, and the approach is very cooperative. The advantage of this type of testing is it's often very efficient. The disadvantage, though, is that the report may have less impact, particularly if there are any configuration changes that were made to allow the test to continue. There's also a tendency to want to fix during the testing, and so if there's a lot of changes made during the testing no longer is as accurate. Covert penetration testing, the knowledge is limited to management, or generally to a subset of management, and the approach is adversarial. So the IT folks, or even security personnel or other third-party personnel, don't know that the test is actually happening, just a subset of management. The advantage is it's a very valid test of incident detection and incident response capabilities, but the disadvantage is they may not get past barriers that an intruder with more time and resources would be able to. So many organizations choose to do both types of testing to get the advantages of both. Our testing team may also have different levels of knowledge about the target environment. In a zero-knowledge test, the testing team has not been provided any relevant information about the target. In a partial knowledge test, the testing team has been provided some relevant information about the target. In a full knowledge, the testing team has intimate knowledge of the target. Then sometimes when we're doing testing, we will have both a defending team and an attacking team. That's known as red team and blue team testing. The red team attacks, the blue team defends. Now, our penetration test phases starts with planning and goes all the way through perhaps to retesting and then starts again. So we have a planning phase where we're determining what the scope is of the test and what all of the logistics and the rules of engagement. In the discovery, we are identifying our target. In enumeration, we're learning more about our target. In vulnerability mapping, we are mapping vulnerabilities to what we have learned, to our enumeration. We go through an attack and exploit. At that point, depending on how the assessor is doing, they may need to do additional research. They may then continue the attack and exploit. There's a reporting out period, and then there's proof of concept provided. That should lead to remediation. And then once remediation is concluded, we'll have some retesting. So let's look at each of those phases. In the planning phase, the rules are identified, management approval obtained, and our testing goals are finalized. So our planning phase topics include the scope, which is the systems in the network to be included or excluded, the scenarios that we're going to be using, the type and the level of testing that's permitted, logistical details, data handling requirements, and incident handling guidance. In the discovery, enumeration, and vulnerability mapping phases, we're going to be focusing first on the footprinting and gathering information. That's what's happening during our initial discovery. In our enumeration phase, we are identifying the resources. In the vulnerability mapping phase, we're identifying the vulnerabilities to be exploited. As we move into the attack and exploit phase, we're trying to confirm that the vulnerabilities exist and in fact they can be exploited. The majority of vulnerabilities exploited during a penetration test fall into the following categories. Our first category is surprise applications. These are applications that have been installed but no one's paid a lot of attention to. Maybe they're not documented. It's actually a surprise that they exist. And the challenge with surprise applications is that they are not being maintained, they're not being patched, we're not looking for known vulnerabilities to fix. They're just sitting out there being dormant with exposed vulnerabilities. There might be default settings, which include admin passwords, so default settings for a device or application that's never been changed that can be exploited. Unsupported legacy software or operating systems. These would be software and operating systems that are beyond end of life, that are no longer being supported by the publishers, and there's no longer any security patches or updates being provided for. We might have misconfigurations. We may have systems that have not been hardened. We may have systems that have been unpatched. Incorrect file and directory permissions, and then operating system or software exploits. So common operating system and software exploits include kernel flaws, buffer overflows, and injections. Now we've actually talked about all three of these in previous lessons. In a kernel flaw, we're looking at the kernel code, and the kernel code is the core of an operating system, and it enforces the overall security model. So any flaw in the kernel puts the entire system at risk, and one of the most common flaws is what leads to local escalation privileges. A buffer overflow is when too much data is accepted as input for a specific process. If an attacker can overflow the buffer memory with malicious instructions, the process will carry out the instructions and give the attacker access to all of the resources that the process has access to. Injection is a failure to properly validate input from the client or environment. Injection flaws occur when the application sends untrusted data, in this case malicious commands, to an interpreter, to our processor. So operating system kernel flaws, memory buffer overflows, process injections. Those are our three most common operating system and software exploits. Both throughout and at the conclusion of the testing, results need to be communicated. The penetration test findings are generally reported at the conclusion of the engagement. However, it's not uncommon for the rules of engagement, or the ROE, to require that a contact be notified immediately if a high-severity vulnerability is identified, if a critical system is exploited, or if confidential information is exposed. So it's going to be very important that those are defined in the rules of engagement and that the testers or the assessors have instructions to do so. Penetration test report should include the vulnerability findings, all the exploit activities, and then, as applicable, recommendations for mitigation. So whenever possible, the vulnerability findings should be categorized, perhaps by severity, and then referenced with appropriate CVE notation. The exploit activities should be documented with enough detail so that they're reproducible. And mitigation recommendations should be prioritized and, as applicable, include risk reduction and security enhancement recommendations. So that brings us to the end of Lesson 6.6. In Lesson 6.6, we talked about the objectives of a penetration test. We talked about test scenarios, whether they're going to be internal or external. We talked about all of the test phases. Talked about common operating system exploit, including kernel flaws, buffer overflows, and process injection. Talked about the communication of findings, and lastly, reporting our findings and the expectations of what we should be sharing. So that brings us to our Lesson 6.6, Match the Meaning. Terms on the left-hand column: red team, blue team, zero knowledge, enumeration, covert testing, a kernel, a buffer overflow, and injection. Some are brand new in this lesson, some you've seen in previous lessons. So I'd like you to put me on pause, take the time you need, match these up, come on back, and we'll go through them together. Let's take a look at our Lesson 6.6 terms. A red team is a simulated attacker. A blue team is a simulated defender. Red team attacks, blue team defends. A zero knowledge test is a blind test. It's when the tester has no knowledge or has extraordinarily limited knowledge of the test environment. Enumeration is resource identification. So whenever we're doing enumeration, we're identifying the resources, or in this case, our attack targets. Covert testing can be used to validate incident response capabilities, because in covert testing, only management or a subset of management knows the testing is happening. That means that those responsible for detecting an incident or reporting an incident have no prior knowledge that the test is scheduled. So the validation is, do they notice the test, and do our incident response procedures work? A kernel is the core of an operating system. A buffer overflow is too much input for a specific process. Lastly, injection occurs when there's a failure to validate user input. As always, we're going to end with our CISSP exam tips. Red team attacks, blue team defends. Penetration testing may include non-technical methods of attack, may include physical entry, may also include social engineering, and that penetration testing can be very useful for determining incident detection and response capabilities. Thanks for joining me for this lesson. I look forward to seeing you in the next.